Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast. I'm coming at you from sunny Boca Raton, Florida. Got a really special guest on the show today, Leila Alami. Leila's a friend. She is a clinical psychophysiologist, a psychotherapist, and a board-certified neurotherapist. She did a lot of schooling. She got a master's of mental health at Nova Southeastern University with a clinical track in neurological disorders. And then she did a biomedical neuroscience graduate certified specialty, medical neuroscience. I think that's it, at the University of Florida College of Medicine. So Leila is a really interesting person, and I look forward to, happy to have you on the show.
Hello.
Hello. All right. So to start things off, I wanted to kind of ask you, as far as how and why, you kind of got into this line of work. How, what originally sparked your interest in neuroscience or neurology, psychology, that sort of stuff.
Well, the brain obviously is very mysterious in many ways. So when I started getting interested in psychology, I couldn't just stop in the psychology major. I basically had to move on and learn about the physiology, because psychology leads to physiology, physiology leads to psychology. So therefore, I got into it with very high interest, which led to a career path. So,
Right.
And then I specialized in the brain trauma, which was very interesting because you see different patients that have the same diagnoses that react differently in many ways. So that strikes up a lot of interest in me.
Yeah.
A little bit of the background where I did pre-med, which led to which was a foundation to actually do the biomedical neuroscience after my master's degree. And that's because psychology and physiology, they're very intertwined. So therefore, in my opinion, you have to learn about both of them in order to have a good understanding of what the mind and body connections do.
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you there. I think it was weird because in my undergrad, I did psychology and biology, and sometimes people didn't really understand the connection between the two, but I was like, how do you not how can you understand the brain
Right.
just either just from a psychological perspective, just talking about theories and or on the vice versa, like you can't just understand the
Right.
chemicals
Or just the philosophy of it. There's more
Yeah.
into it.
Yeah. So for you, the psychology came first. Is that right? Or did?
My undergrad in psychology, I was doing psychology and pre-med at the same time
Okay.
through my undergrad.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the pre-med opened doors for me after my master's, when I decided to kind of keep going after my master's and specialize. So that was a strong foundation because of the physical sciences that I studied.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever feel like it's really cool what you've been able to do as far as actually integrating what you're passionate about with a career? I think a lot of people they have hobbies or what they're really interested in is not actually what they end up doing for work.
Right.
Was it tough for you originally starting out to be able to figure out how am I gonna integrate this into a career path, or did it kind of just organically come about?
I always had a plan in my head. Funny enough, during my graduate studies, I was the only one that actually thought about specializing afterwards. And like you said, people couldn't understand why, coming from clinical mental health, why are you, doing other studies with the physical sciences? But in my mind, I think it's important. Definitely, like I said, psychology and physiology, they're very much intertwined, and you can't understand one without the other.
Yeah.
So after my clinical mental health, I went on and I specialized, and it does open doors for me in different ways. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And you touched on something earlier that I think is really important as far as like with with different patients, with you're saying like the same diagnoses, experiencing different kind of results, right? From
Right.
from different therapies. And that's something I feel like maybe is common with all forms of medicine, but probably particularly with the brain, just because we all have
Right.
such unique, neurochemistry that differs, from one
Exactly.
individual to another. Is that
Exactly.
is that part of like what got you got you kind of interested just because it's not like a one size fits all?
Yeah, it's the curiosity too.
Yeah,
I think that's built in me is that, okay, so this person has a stroke, but then let's find out, it's kind of like, where is the stroke located? So they're going to actually react to it differently psychologically. When you know the anatomy of the location of the stroke, some people lose their speech, or Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia when it's on the left side. And if it's in the frontal lobe, then personality changes could occur. So it's a stroke. However, knowing the anatomy, hence the physiology of what's going on in there, can lead to some answers psychologically speaking.
right. Yeah, I mean it's kind of I view it kind of like peeling back, layers of the onion, or kind of like figuring out like, because it's like the brain is, like the what do they call it? Like the most complex thing in the universe. You've
Absolutely.
heard that, right? Yeah, so it's like, there's all of these different, variables at play like you're talking about, with looking at what area of the brain, what happened in what area, and what that is actually resulting in can completely differ. And
Yeah.
I think the other thing I think that's really interesting nowadays is all the kind of genetic things that we're learning about, like genetic predispositions to certain things, or how, I mean, I feel like, there's like all like say like pharmacology, you take
Hmm.
pharmacology, and there's starting to be like basically, you know, they'll be able to see like based off what your genes are, which drugs are more likely to kind of like
Yeah,
work
I've heard of
the
that.
most.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
It's pretty
wonder if
neat.
yeah, it is neat. I
Yeah.
wonder if we'll get to a point where, we'll be able to see kind of like maybe with a certain genetic, identity, whether you'll be kind of more likely to experience X after a stroke. Do you
Mm.
think that's maybe going to be part of future
I
research?
mean, maybe. Medicine is, you got to keep an open mind, especially with medicine, because you don't know what research could come up with. We're coming up with new breakthroughs every single day. So, could be. Who knows?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. All right. Well, I know you're really interested in as far as kind of love and the brain, kind of going through the neurochemistry. Can you kind of
Mhm.
break that down as far as, what
Uh,
love kind of what is happening in the brain when you say fall in love?
Love. Is a strong feeling, isn't it? Well, you definitely have the happy neurochemicals going through the brain when you're in love. You have dopamine is one of them, serotonin is another, oxytocin is actually considered the love hormone. So, as we probably know, you have serotonin that regulates mood, sleep, memory, even sexual pleasure. And then dopamine actually is the brain's reward system. It regulates, it gives us, that reward feeling to make us feel good and be motivated and all of those emotions. And oxytocin is considered the love hormone. And it's a it's very actually it's very much increased in women, because especially when a woman is pregnant, Oxytocin allows the mother to be connected to the fetus, and as the baby's, the fetus is growing inside her belly, and that's, yeah, oxytocin definitely, when the brain doesn't have enough, especially like let's say breakups, um, those neurochemicals start to drop, therefore can lead to depression. And that's why a lot of people, it's not such a good feeling when you were in love and then suddenly you go through a breakup. A lot of people go through some rough times.
You don't enjoy that?
Not at all.
So let's just walk through the actual like progression of things. So say you meet someone. So from my understanding, it's kind of like dopamine and serotonin are probably like acting first, like where there's kind of like the desire, the sort of,
The
going,
motivation to
the
chase the
right,
lady,
right.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then the serotonin kind of being the, you're feeling good being around that person. I think, a lot of people don't think about it, but I think we're really drawn to people, like we want to hang around people who bring out positive emotions in us. And
absolutely.
what they're really doing, I think, is basically triggering those happy neurochemicals. There's like getting a lot of dopamine, serotonin flowing, and that kind of attracts us, whether that's, I think, romantically or just, with friends. But then it seems like oxytocin is kind of more of the kind of, is that sort of like more longer term, sort of like building like a, relationship?
Right. Well, it's saying that it does make you fall in love, and like you said, it starts with the chase, and which is the dopamine levels, and then the feelings, which is the serotonin, and then oxytocin is more of a strong feeling of being in love. That's why it's important when you go through breakups that you don't just isolate. Also, dopamine. Some people after a breakup start to crave that dopamine, the desire, which that person kind of left with that, along with them, and just left them alone. So it's important to realize that when people go through breakups, there are kind of like few key points that you're gonna need to go through, and so that you don't fall into depression, because that's actually it's a serious case when and it does happen. You go through depression after a breakup. So one of the key points is, don't look at pictures of your significant other when you break up. Don't go through their social media. Don't stalk them. Don't just, look for that internal satisfaction, even though when they're no longer around.
Would you prescribe
Actually,
like burning pictures of them? Is that a good?
I wouldn't recommend that. You might burn the house down. um, Dopamine, because people actually they start seeking that dopamine craving by simply looking at pictures. So you don't want to satisfy that, because that can lead again to a drop in dopamine and leads to depression. It's kind of like a withdrawal feeling. The second one is disrupt the excessive thinking, the obsessive thoughts about your significant other or your ex. Sometimes if you were really deeply in love and you go through a breakup, sometimes you do need to go to a psychotherapist and process how are you going to switch your thinking around. And it's true, and kind of decrease that obsessive thinking. CBT is really handy in those situations, cognitive behavioral therapy, which switches your thinking patterns to move on with life. Another thing is new routines, like build a workout routine, because then you get your dopamine levels again, serotonin, endorphins, all of that kick back up. Routine with exercise, yoga, eating healthy, all of that does matter. And lastly, I would think kind of like, don't think of only about the good things you had with your ex. start thinking about the bad things that they did too, because that can help with the breakups, kind of, and help you move on.
Right. Interesting. So, as far as like, I was thinking because dopamine, is really involved. Like, we get the most amount of dopamine when there's like a novelty, right? Where it's like something for the first time. Whether that's
That rush.
doing a drug, where you're getting like the highest high the first time you do it, and then with drug addicts, they're trying to like build back up to get that, that same kind of dopamine hit that they originally got. But do you see the same thing? Like, do you think it's maybe that's kind of why, some people kind of, move from like partner to partner because you sort of get that all of those feel good neurochemicals right at first, but then they kind of wear off, right? Like how, like what makes.
Possibly. I don't think it's definitely it's not one answer to all, because again, we're all chemically built, and it also depends on how were your experiences in the past. If you tend to go from one person to another to get the that adrenaline rush and that dopamine level because of that excitement, then it may have to do with the experiences that you've gone through in your past. That that the brain got wired that way, so you need to kick up constant dopamine levels moving from one person to another. Could be a lot of things.
Also, maybe you think like I feel like oxytocin plays a role as far as like we know. I'm sure you're like familiar with the study with like the male prairie voles. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where basically some of them had oxytocin, and that they, in some of the prairie voles they like blocked the oxytocin, and the ones with blocked oxytocin were like they weren't monogamous, but the ones who had sufficient oxytocin basically bonded with one partner and stuck with them.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
I think that's another kind of
Right.
layer to the puzzle.
Yeah, that's why I had mentioned about the connection between the baby and the mother. The mother tends to create a lot more oxytocin during pregnancy because of that need of connection with the baby.
Hmm. So yeah, that's interesting because it's like oxytocin is like very like versatile in the sense where it's like the romantic love, but then also gets sort of transitioned like to the mother
The
and the baby.
unconditional love.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I
Yeah.
feel like there's been some research too about like mothers like with like insufficient oxytocin, like who aren't able to like bond, right? Have you
Right.
seen any of that
Which
research?
can lead to postpartum depression.
Interesting. Is
Mm.
that so? Do you think that's more of a oxytocin effect, or is that because I've also like is it serotonin too, or maybe some of the hormones that are altered with pregnancy?
I mean, I don't think there is research that pinpoints exactly what's the level of this versus that, but I would imagine it's a combination of definitely the serotonin
Mm-hmm.
as well as the oxytocin. Yeah.
Right. Interesting. And what do you think about like I feel like it's kind of gotten eh, some kind of popularity as far as like people, like because they can do like oxytocin sprays, right? Like I know there's been like because it's also involved like the other thing we didn't really talk about is just like social connection. Like oxytocin plays a big role, and that's one of the things with like autism where there's like problems with the mirror neuron system in the brain, and
Yeah.
that's somewhat regulated by oxytocin. So I know there's some like parents of autistic children who are trying
The
those oxytocin.
spray.
Yeah, what do you think about those sprays? Like, have you seen any research as far as like saying that they work, they don't work?
No, I haven't seen anything about in regards to the spray and autistic
What about just
kids.
what about just in general, like the spray in general? Like, do you think like
I've heard of
taking in exogenous oxytocin works, or
that's
is
an
it kind of
interesting
like we don't really know
question.
yet?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't tried it myself, so I'm not sure how to answer that about perfumes and stuff. But possible that it could take an effect, but again, I don't think it's going to take an effect on everybody, on some maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I feel like we covered that topic pretty well. Um, I know you really specialize and have a ton of, wealth of information about, how sort of like physical trauma affects the brain in the sense of strokes, traumatic brain injuries, right? Can you talk a little as far as, because I feel like, a lot of us kind of, we go about life just kind of thinking, like, oh, we are just kind of like who we are, but at the same time, if one of those devastating things happens to our brain,
Right.
it can result in like huge personality shifts, right?
Absolutely.
Wh-
Go ahead.
No, I was just wanting to see, like what can you talk a little about as far as like what is actually happening maybe on a structural and chemical basis in the brain, say when you have like a stroke?
Well, it depends again where the stroke happened physiologically in the brain. It could result to different things, different dysregulations, psychologically and physiologically. So when a stroke happens, definitely the brain kind of reroutes. So say a stroke happened in the frontal lobe. So sometimes it takes a person a little bit extra to think a certain way, or accomplish certain things, certain movements, or even have memory that's not so quick, because the brain has to bypass that part of the brain that's been unfortunately damaged by the stroke. So um, it's also important to point out that families, not just the patient, families um, go through some dilemmas and some issues, because the person is not the person that was before. So they have to be patient and repeat themselves if they need to, because memory may not be there as efficient as it was before, or go the extra mile to explain certain things a little bit more. And so the family members also have to kind of train themselves. How are they going to handle this new situation? Unfortunately,
Hmm.
it doesn't just affect the person
Right.
only. Yeah.
Right. There's like big family and I mean,
Yeah.
I'm assuming, I don't know how many millions of dollars are lost, with healthcare as well as just society. Those people say, they may not be able to hold down a job or
Right.
not be able to produce the same kind of work performance,
Right.
right?
And the person gets frustrated easily, may get angry. There's a lot, and everybody's different.
Right.
Everybody's different.
Can we back up a little bit and just talk about like, do we know as far as what is actually happening when, what causes a stroke basically?
We don't know. Sometimes they say obesity causes it. Sometimes they say, genetics could cause it.
But what's actually happening, right,
High
is
levels of cholesterol as well.
so but basically with all those things, my understanding is it's kind of like, like your arteries kind of get clogged or whatever and there's
Correct.
insufficient blood flow,
Uh,
like the blood flow kind of gets cut off, right?
exactly. That's exactly what's going on. So the oxygen doesn't go through the brain, and then the stroke happens. Yeah.
Right. Right. And
And
this
then the surrounding area of the stroke also start to die. So therefore, that means the brain cells that are surrounding the stroke area start to not to receive oxygen.
hmm Yeah, and
Yeah,
that's probably resulting in a lot of the kind of neuron loss and brain damage, right?
exactly. Yeah.
So as far as, you know, obviously, like you kind of touched on it as far as, if a stroke, say, impacts, like a specific area of the brain, say the right frontal lobe, other areas of the brain, like your brain's actually very, adaptable. So some like other areas can kind of take over, the function, right? Like maybe not perfectly, but they can sort of try to compensate.
Some,
Some.
some. I mean, some people can actually become handicapped, and they're not gonna be able to walk again or even talk again. So it's some. It all depends, case by case.
Hmm. What
Yeah.
about as far as like, neuroplasticity is something we talk a lot about just kind of currently in neuroscience. As far as like how, obviously when you have a kind of severe sort of like a brain injury like that, the brain obviously is it's going to take a lot, but is it possible, like with the technology that we have, do you think currently that people are at least able to regain a certain level of function? Can your brain figure out can those neurons kind of come back online and those brain, or is it just like those areas just kind of die off?
Hmm. Unfortunately, yeah.
They die off.
Yeah.
Interesting. Do you
Yeah.
think, like, is there research, like, are we going to get to a point where we can figure out how to say like,
Oh,
birth new neurons in those
that's
areas?
interesting. Um, there are research out there that are trying to see if we can rebuild certain neurons, but it's not it hasn't been done in human beings. It's been tested on mice, and but there is research out there. Do I futuristically speaking, I'm not sure if that if we're gonna start making new neurons, say someone is handicapped and then they're unable to walk, and suddenly, we're injecting them and they're gonna start walking all of a sudden. I'm not sure. That's a very, very distant question that may take many years.
Right. Because it's like we have the technology currently, technology, but both of us work with that increases blood flow in the brain and carries more oxygen to areas, but it I guess kind of depends as far as if those areas have been damaged so much that that oxygen isn't really able to do
Right.
anything, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And as far as I know, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. And then as far as like with
With severe damage, it's not very reversible. There is a very, very thin chance.
yeah. Yeah, it's really sad. I mean, I think a lot about like, neurodegenerative conditions. I mean, Alzheimer's is huge right now, and it's I think something that because we're living longer, humans are living longer. Modern medicine has figured out how to, sort of deal with a lot of the other kind of,
Right.
problems that result, say, in our, 60s and 70s. But I read something as far as like, basically if you don't die of heart disease, you're gonna kind of
Yeah.
die of Alzheimer's most likely,
Dementia,
or at least
yeah.
die with Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
That's kind of a
Yeah,
scary proposition.
with those types of cases, we're at this point now we're able to maintain it, but not necessarily heal it.
Hmm. Because
Um,
yeah, a
we
lot
can
of the
maintain it for many, many years, but I mean, completely get rid of the disease. Yeah, we haven't gotten there yet.
right, right. Because I know like the medications, used to treat Alzheimer's are very ineffective. They keep trying to come out with the magic pill that's
Right.
gonna supposedly solve it, but you know, they
Yeah,
continue
same with
failing.
Parkinson's disease. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And it actually sort of it's kind of a good transition because I feel like, with a lot of these things and just kind of brain health in general, it comes down to more so like prevention, right? Than like actually, you know, once you have one of these conditions, once you have a stroke, once you have Alzheimer's, it's really difficult to deal with, at least where we are at,
Right.
currently speaking. But as far as living, really healthy lifestyles, we know now with, epigenetics and all of the different things, we can actually, really decrease our odds, of a lot of these things happening, right?
Right. Working out, eating healthy, those are definitely keys to at least kind of avoid those situations, especially with stroke.
hmm Is that more so like the kind of increasing blood flow, say with exercise?
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
And also, I think with the diet, I think that's something, both of us have, a common interest in, like as far as eating, I'm guessing an anti-inflammatory diet is gonna kind of prevent that sort of, I mean, basically like my understanding is basically, you know, with any sort of brain inflammation or like say a stroke, it's basically those arteries or whatever are kind of getting clogged and inflamed, or
Right.
with a traumatic brain injury, that's literally where, there's a damage to the, brain, like physical damage, and it's like, I mean, everyone can see if, say, if you sprain your ankle and your ankle balloons, up in size, but you can't really see that inflammation oftentimes, like
In the brain.
in the brain, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Do you
Um,
think? Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, like you said, definitely the brain, you cannot open up your brain and, hey, let me check out if I'm okay, if I'm going to be okay next year or two. Am I healthy enough? Is it possible that I may get a stroke by next year? Yeah, you can't do that. So just basically following a good diet, working out, even keeping the stress levels down. The cortisol hormones can just what they say, stress can kill. So when you feel like you're getting high levels of stress during your daily life, it's important to um, either get help from a psychotherapist, from a professional that can help you with certain situations, situational stress in life, because that can help you physiologically speaking as well.
hmm And how about in school, with your research, or education in microbiology, what were the biggest takeaways from that as far as how our gut actually influences our brain function?
There is a very, very strong connection of the gut to the brain. The gut is actually considered the second brain. And part of that is actually because the gut produces an estimation of 90 to 95% of serotonin. And serotonin is our happy hormone. So that's that's the key element here to take away when it comes to gut brain connection.
hmm
And I'm gonna go towards the nutrition part of it. When you have a healthy diet, whatever you're putting in really does matter, because when you're having a healthy diet instead of just junk food, um, the gut is happy, therefore the brain is happy.
Right. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen there's some studies as far as actually like giving, I think it was, yeah, it actually was human subjects, giving them, certain probiotic species, and actually say, for one of them, I think, it substantially decreased anxiety levels.
Yes.
So we really know that,
Absolutely.
the composition of your gut, all of those different microbes really does impact brain function.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, Healthy food can definitely change your mood.
hmm
So when you're eating healthy, and you're keeping up with the good diet, it does play an impact
Right.
with
So
the yeah.
so I feel like for most people, it's like in this day and age, we're very well aware of like, kind of the damage of junk food. We know McDonald's isn't good for you, but I feel like we're more divided than ever as far as like what actually, everyone has and people get
Right.
it.
You're allowed a cheat day, but not don't make it
Yeah.
7 days a week.
Well, yeah, sure, but more so like because everyone now has, some diet philosophy that they subscribe to. It's like, the vegans and the vegetarians and paleo and
Yeah,
keto, and
it
it's
gets
like
confusing. Yeah,
it's
it's like what is
confusion. Yeah, but like, do you think that one say one nutritional philosophy over another really has better research, or is it more individualized based on, kind of what works for you?
I'm not sure. Well, I know Mediterranean diet is known to be very healthy with the olive oil and you know um that's and fish and all of that with the omega 3s and all of that. Besides that, I mean, all kinds of diets get confusing to me. I'm just like, which one is which?
Yeah. I think like to all of us, yeah, it's like
Yeah,
and everyone there's all these supposed,
yeah.
nutrition
Every
experts.
month there is something new.
Yeah. Yeah. But how I think of it, there's commonalities in a lot of this where it's like pretty much everyone agrees veggies are good for you. You know, there's not many people who are saying, don't eat veggies.
And fish.
And fish, yeah, that's another big one. Yeah, like the omega 3s you mentioned. They really cut down on overall inflammation, which in turn brain inflammation, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And is that
Except
something?
for too much fish. I mean, I'm talking about excessive seafood could lead to mercury. So you gotta, things have to be in moderation.
Right, right. And how do you know, like specifically the omega 3s? What are they doing that benefits our health or brain function?
Well, they're nutrients, just like the protein is a nutrient to the brain. So they give energy for brain processes. So um, it's important. That's how we work,
Right, right.
function.
What do you think about as far as like, fat in the brain? I think that's like a really it's kind of an emerging topic that more and more people are talking about, like high fat diet, like high good fat diets actually being really beneficial. And you mentioned like the olive oil,
That's the good fat.
yeah, it's a
The
good
good.
fat. Well, like avocados, coconut oil,
Those are the good fat.
almond butter. Yeah, there's like lots of good fats, and we know that the brain is actually primarily fat.
Mhm.
So it kind of
Like
makes
French
sense.
fries, too much French fries.
Probably not good. See, I,
No.
I I feel like that's where a lot of people like, like think, oh yeah, like, when they think of fat, they think of like fast food. And that's why I think a
Right.
lot of like high fat diets are like demonized. But if we're talking like high good fat, eating lots of avocados and coconut, I think that is actually really good for the
Cooking
brain.
with olive oil, stuff like that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh, those are the good fats. Those are the ones you want to go towards.
right. I know
Yeah.
olive oil in particular, I'd read something about that it actually breaks up like there's certain chemicals in olive oil that actually break up the amyloid beta plaques that form in Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Really?
why Mediterranean diets are good. They're
Uh-huh.
known to be very, very good diets.
Right. So what else are they're eating? Lots of olive oil, lots of
Chickpeas,
veggies, fish,
fish, chickpeas,
drinking
what
a lot of
else?
wine too, right?
Shrimp. Huh?
They're drinking a lot of wine too, right?
No,
No,
not
not
necessarily. No.
well, that's one that's like I feel like, ever since that the stuff came out about like resveratrol, in wine like being good for you, people like are
Um,
like, "Oh, like wine's good," but
yeah,
but
we
we
have
know
to
it's
we
like
have to be careful with those statements because the problem is there's always a conflicting research too when it comes to stuff like that. It's like they say, oh, one glass of wine is good for you to fall asleep. But then the problem is once the person or the brain gets adapted to that one glass of wine, it may lead to two, to three. That you build such a high tolerance that 6 months down the line, you don't need just one glass. You may need three to fall asleep. And so we have to be careful with those things. Someone who has an addiction in alcohol, that that pattern, that daily pattern is not necessarily good for them because they have addictive behaviors.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm with you there as far as what I was gonna say as far as like the resveratrol like supposedly being this really, I mean it actually is a really good compound that can it extends lifespan in like rodents and mice. I don't think we know in humans yet, but I think like it got misinterpreted like
Right.
by like where media outlets are saying, oh, wine has resveratrol, therefore wine's good
Have
for
one glass every night to fall asleep, but you're patterning yourself to become dependent on that one glass of wine.
right. And also the resveratrol I was seeing, it's like you would need to drink like basically the amount of wine that would kill you in a day to actually get the proper doses of resveratrol that would actually, be beneficial for your health. So it's not,
Yeah.
it's something that's actually kind of another interesting topic as far as how like a lot of times like there's a lot of misinterpretation I think spread by media outlets who are kind of like improperly reporting the actual science and research.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's really cool nowadays where researchers are like I think more approachable than ever. Say like they have Twitter and
Right.
Insta, so you could actually,
They
and now
have a
they're writing,
podcast.
they have podcasts now they're writing books. So it's like I feel like we're getting better at actually getting the direct information from the source.
Yeah.
Do you
That's
do
why
you
it's
see that?
always important to read the thin lines at the bottom, because it's going to give you the breakdown.
But see, no one does that. I was talking in a previous podcast with my buddy Michael, and he's a reporter for the student newspaper at Oregon, and interns at the Wall Street Journal. And we were talking as far as how it's really problematic that like most people like just see say the headline but don't actually read the article because we're
Right.
getting like bombarded by so much information, say on just scrolling through your Twitter feed. So a lot of people like, there's all these clickbait headlines, but people aren't actually like reading the
Reading.
articles.
Yeah.
Do
A
you see that
hundred.
like do you see that in your line of work? Like, do you see like say patients come in who are very misinformed because of that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. People, like you said, people just are so quick to just look at the summary or the abstract, and then they don't go into the details of what happened with the research, how did the conclusion come about, and um, because we don't have time, unfortunately. A lot of people these days don't have time to sit and read thoroughly through a journal.
Yeah.
um, um,
People
so
working nine to
right,
fives and raising kids, like, yeah,
right,
they're not gonna have time to sit
right.
down and scroll. I mean, even people who do have time to do that, there's limitless. You could spend your whole life reading
Yeah,
research papers.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So what do
Which ends up hurting the public because that one person who read that non-detailed title is gonna spread the word and post it on Facebook or post it on a social media, and the other person is just gonna read that one sentence, and by the time it gets to the 50th person, that's it's a whole other research.
yeah, it's like the game telephone, right? Where you're like whispering
Yeah,
slang into someone's ear, and it by the time it gets around the circle, it's a completely different word. I
yeah.
think yeah, a similar thing happens.
Unfortunate, yeah.
Yeah. Do you see like like kind of a solution to that, or I mean,
Let's see.
like
Never thought about that.
like potentially like the okay, so for instance, like I'm reading this book right now. It's called like Longevity, um, the science of why aging is. Let me pull up the actual title so I don't. Oh wait, no, it's Lifespan: Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to, and it's by a Dr. David Sinclair. And he's a Harvard professor. He's taught at Harvard for like the past 30 years, and he talked like in the introduction of the book, like because this book is like written for the public, you know, it's like talking about all this like complicated research where he's kind of trying to break it down into understandable information that
Right.
actually is going to benefit the public. But he was talking about how like there's not a lot of incentive for like research, like people who are deeply in the research, like academia, they're getting the majority of their money by doing studies and writing, say, journal articles and, chapters of a journal. Like they're not. That's kind of my idea is like if we can get the information, if more researchers actually speak to the public directly.
Right. Or maybe social media should hire researchers to kind of like break it down to the most relevant details and put it in one or two paragraphs that is accurate
Yeah.
instead of that. So maybe that's a future. Hiring more researchers within the social media environment and having them read the studies accurately and then understanding the studies the way they should be understood and having them summarize it.
I think
So,
that's a really interesting idea that I think would be really beneficial. But I feel like, and this is something I also talked to Michael about like how, when say we're going through our Twitter feed or Instagram, it's all curated, based off our followers. So for instance, you would still need to say follow those people to get that accurate research. Like people could still go follow Joe Schmo who's, talking about, you know, some, like the bro science or whatever that isn't actually real. So it's like all, I think it's just another aspect of actually being able to, get that, the accurate research into the right hands. I think
mhm. Yeah,
maybe we'll figure out a way around that. I don't know.
one day.
One day, maybe.
One day.
Well, listen, I wanna sort of transition here to kind of just another topic. I'm really curious because you've you've done lots of degree programs, lots of higher education, lots of certifications, and I'm curious like how like what's your sort of thought process as far as like thinking, is this going to like because obviously it's going to take a lot of time, it's going to take a lot of money. How do you think about like whether it's actually going to be worth it? Like is that what's your thinking there?
About what? About
Well,
education?
well, yeah, is whether I mean, education costs so much nowadays where it's like, is it worth actually doing like, is it actually going to get
Or
me?
like what I did with the dual education?
Well, yeah, I mean, just with like all your degrees, or with any certifications, you've committed money, you've committed time to pursue these things. I'm assuming in hopes that it's gonna, you know, get you the
Right.
knowledge or certifications to advance in your career.
Yeah. Um, Learning is continuous. So, after you graduate, after people go through grad school, whatever, the learning part of it never stops. You still have to go to conferences, like we were just saying. Medicine gets so advanced by the monthly or sometimes by the daily, that we need to keep up with and that's picking the right grad school or picking more certifications or more specific education. That's more based on opinions. To me, I chose that path because I needed a dual education to understand the body and mind. And in order for me to comprehend all of that, and even when I do continue in education, I can understand what they're talking about because with psychology and uh, hardcore physical sciences, like I was saying, they're very much intertwined. One leads to another and vice versa. So I can't sit in a conference and really understand neuroscience without having a background of neuroscience, or sit in a psychology conference without really understanding the, the psychology theories. But it is a personal choice. It did take me a long time. However, it was worth it for me.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like for what you wanted to do, there was a very specific, well, maybe not specific, but you did need certain degrees, certain certifications.
Yeah.
Um, I just think about it like nowadays, like I think a lot of people are like, getting dissuaded from like pursuing, certain, aspects of higher, going into grad programs just because of the cost. And
Right.
I get thinking like, is that gonna like lead to a societal change? Like, are there gonna be less doctors and lawyers, like people who are, who people like don't want to spend all of this money and then potentially have student debt that they're never going to be able to pay off?
Well, in any field, when you specialize, obviously, it's going to cost more time and money. So if you're capable in doing it and you really want to specialize, then it's a good route, because it's going to open doors, because you're very, and it has to be your passion. You can't follow something without being passionate about it, because it's just it's going to come a time in your life where you're going to be bored because you're not so passionate.
Hmm.
So passion goes a long way. I think it actually, to me personally, it starts with passion, and then education will grow.
I'm absolutely with you on that one. There was actually another podcast I did with my buddy Carl, who's a med student right now, and we talked a lot about passion, as far as like that's what he's really inspired to do this stuff and make a positive difference in the world, not because his family is telling him to do so or
Right.
because he thinks he's going to get a lot of money as a doctor.
Right.
Like those
Right.
things might happen, and that's cool, like
Right.
but he's really driven by this burning desire to make a positive difference.
Right.
Is it, you feel kind of the same, like
Yeah.
with your own? Yeah.
It definitely started with a passion, and then it grew into interest, and then the education came next.
Yeah. Yeah, because I don't know if you've experienced this like in your classes, um, because like Carl was saying how in some of his, med school classes, it's like, he can easily spot the people who are there, because their parents wanted them to become a doctor, like people like who are
Yeah.
just like, it's like because you have to commit so many hours, so much hard work to doing something like, becoming a doctor. I think it's nearly impossible, at least from his perspective, I think, to actually do all of that when you're not driven by your own
Right.
desire to do it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Did,
You're not.
did you notice
Again,
that in
it's
people, like in classes you took, people
yeah.
who like were there for the wrong reason?
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Because even if the person is capable into putting themselves through med school or grad school or any kind of school that needs a higher education, um, and they're not passionate about it, it's going to get a point where they're going to dislike it. And then what?
Right.
It's so, yeah, definitely passion goes a long way. And you
Absolutely.
become more creative in your career as well.
Yeah. So I want to kind of wrap up with sort of like, where do you see, you know, the kind of the future of neurology and psychology? It seems like we're making such fast progress as far as like, you kind of talked about a little, as far as just new research developments, constantly. Like, what do you see any like big changes that are, coming, say in the near future, as far as those different fields go, or the way we say treat patients with different psychiatric or neurological conditions?
It's interesting because I think we've been we're starting to go into, a lot of the people are starting to go towards the natural aspect of it instead of psychiatric medicine. I'm not talking about the severe cases that need psychiatric medicine, but yeah, people are more in tune with more natural treatments, with meditation, um, neuromodulation, things like that. I could see that growing more and more as we're moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. There is, I think, a desire amongst most people to sort of do things that, like not putting external chemicals in their
Hmm.
body and get sort of,
Yeah,
you know, kind of take a more natural approach.
right. And
Um,
not that some people, don't need them, or many people don't need them. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, when it's something that it's mild, just stress levels or mild depression. I think people are more in tune now into figuring out how can they decrease those feelings or those symptoms with more natural um, treatments.
right. I think like what's cool and maybe what's in part sort of contributing to those movements growing is that they've actually been finding it to be effective. Like it's, I think for a while it was like, the only people that meditated were like hippies. It was very like kind of
Yeah.
counterculture. But now there's like meditation classes being taught at Google and like, the biggest Fortune 500 Silicon Valley companies because they know it works. They know it's going to improve workers, efficiency and get,
Yeah, and motivation and all of
motivation.
that. Yeah.
In addition to,
Productivity.
yeah. Also, I
Yeah.
think just their morale, happier workers, I think are gonna, you know, produce better work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Layla, thank you so much for coming
You're
on the show
welcome.
today. Yeah.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, I really enjoyed that discussion.
Same here
All
as well.
right. All right. Is there anything as far as anything you want to plug? If people like wanted, well, I don't know if you want people to get in touch with you or not, but
Well, you can
if
put that under your podcast. You can title it. You can put you can add my LinkedIn if you want.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then as far as if people want to connect with the podcast, we're Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast on Instagram. Also, we are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, if you want to just listen to the audio version, but we are also on YouTube. Roscoe's Wetsuit is the YouTube username. So go ahead, like and subscribe. You know what to do. All right.
Right. Bye, Toby.
Bye, Layla.
See you.